The leaders of NATO's newest members, Sweden and Finland, have arrived in Washington for the bloc summit getting underway today. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, arrived at a military airbase just outside of the U.S. capital. Both countries joined the alliance after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Ensuring Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself against Russia will be top of the agenda at the summit. NATO has been discussing the prospect of Ukrainian membership for years. However, it's not expected to be discussed at this summit.
NATO countries have said they'll support Ukraine as long as it takes in its fight against Russian aggression, which NATO has described as an existential threat. Russian President Vladimir Putin, for his part, sees NATO's eastward expansion to his country's borders as a justification for his war on Ukraine. Following Moscow's first illegal land grab of Crimea in 2014, Kyiv sought to join the Western military alliance for greater protection. NATO countries have said Ukraine will eventually become a member. But at last year's summit in Vilnius, the alliance refused to commit to a timeline, a huge disappointment for President Volodymyr Zelensky. This year, the alliance is trying to better manage expectations for Kyiv. The focus is on what's being called building a bridge to the future.
We will agree to work more closely with the Ukrainian armed forces, including at the new NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center in Poland. We will also work together to build Ukraine's defense industry and deepen our cooperation on innovation. All the work we are doing together is making Ukraine stronger, more interoperable and better prepared than ever to join our alliance.
In the meantime, Zelensky has been securing bilateral defense agreements with a number of individual NATO member countries. In May, several European partners pledged more aid, including F-16 fighter jets. Ukraine has also asked for more help with its air defenses, including Patriot missile systems. With NATO membership not likely in the immediate future, Ukraine continues to push for bilateral assurances, most recently from neighboring Poland, one of Kyiv's most vocal allies. Still, Zelensky hopes for more aid from NATO.
I expect very concrete answers and steps from our partners at the NATO summit. We'll have a meeting dedicated to reinforcing Ukraine's air defenses, to our civilian infrastructure, water supplies, and the energy grid. I expect concrete steps.
NATO members last week stopped short of backing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's request for a multi-year funding package for Ukraine. The recent budget battle in the U.S. also underscored the limits to leaders' official pledges, with Ukraine aid increasingly becoming instrumentalized in domestic political battles.
DW's Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl is at the summit, and she told us more about what NATO leaders aim to accomplish as they meet in the U.S. Capitol.
Right, Nicole, we're here in Washington where NATO was founded 75 years ago. So this is actually also a birthday party, if you wish, this 75th NATO summit here in the capital of the United States. But of course, they're not only looking backwards and celebrate the strength they gained over the years and the 32 members. Never have there been so many member states at NATO. This summit is also taking place in a moment with many uncertainties. You just talked about Ukraine, but it's not only Ukraine which is discussed here. It's also how NATO can face the challenges from China. So the South Pacific strategy will also play a major role here, and head of states from Japan, for example, or New Zealand and Australia also here to discuss how NATO, how the alliance can deepen their partnerships with countries from the South Pacific. And I just want to use this chance to recommend our viewers to turn on our DW YouTube channel and watch our documentary, which is giving us a little bit of a deeper insight about this South Pacific strategy.
All right, let's hope they stick with us for as long as the show runs, at least. Ines, you say Ukraine is not the only topic on the agenda, but it is front and center, and not all NATO members agree on how to support Kyiv. The presidential election in the U.S. is creating even more uncertainty in that regard. So how are these challenges going to be addressed at the summit?
Yeah, that's definitely the big elephant here in the room. What happens if Donald Trump will be re-elected on November 5th when the presidential elections are taking place here, especially now with the huge debate about the current president, President Joe Biden, who is a strong supporter of Ukraine from day one on. But what if Trump comes back to the White House? As we all know, he already threatened to leave NATO during his last presidency. So it will all come down to the question of burden sharing. Many, especially Eastern European countries, want the member states to pay 3% of a GDP instead only 2% what they're doing now. So we will watch that very closely and report closely about these issues, how much money which country wants to spend, and of course how much or how different countries support Ukraine's way into a full membership of the alliance. These are major topics which will be discussed the following days.
That was our Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl speaking to us there live from the NATO summit. Thank you so much. Well, let's look at the Russian side. Joining us now from Riga is our former Moscow Bureau Chief, Juri Rescheto. He's reported from Latvia since authorities shut down DW's bureau in Russia. Juri, good to see you. Now, how does the Kremlin view this NATO summit?
Well, Nicole, for the Kremlin, NATO is pretty much, I would say, enemy number one. And that is why NATO's 75th anniversary celebrations are a thorn in the Kremlin's side, especially considering that NATO is celebrating, we've heard it, its 75-year history as a success. Moscow sees its war against Ukraine, by the way, as a war that NATO is allegedly fighting against Russia. That's what Russian state propaganda claims. The Russians argue that NATO states are supplying Ukraine with weapons, training Ukrainian soldiers and supporting Kyiv with money. So that means that from the Russian point of view, NATO states are at war with Russia. At the same time, President Putin claimed a few weeks ago that Russia was not crazy enough to want to actually go to war with NATO directly.
Now, since Finland and Sweden joined, the alliance is even bigger and right on Russia's border. Now, what do you expect Putin to do in response to something he so eagerly wanted to prevent, an expansion of NATO?
You're right. Russia has already indicated that it will, for example, move its troops directly to the Finnish border. Since Finland joined NATO last year, you said it, that means that they are moving troops to the new NATO border with Russia, which is extremely long, almost 1,300 kilometers. And it's unprotected, this border, on both sides. Now Finland wants to change that and build a wall. The Baltic countries, by the way, of Latvia and Lithuania, where I'm right now, are already doing that. Also, they are building a border fence with Russia. And of course, Russia is also stepping up its rhetoric. From time to time, there is talk of nuclear weapons being stationed in Kaliningrad, for example, the Russian enclave in the Baltic Sea. The Russians also want to station Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus, in neighboring Belarus, or may even have already stationed some of them there. But here too, Moscow places the blame on the West by saying that it's the NATO states that are threatening Russia with nuclear weapons, and Russia is only responding.
That was DW's Juri Rescheto joining us from Riga. Thank you so much.
And for more, we can talk now to Chris Chivvis. He's a senior fellow and director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank. That's in Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW, Chris. Thanks so much for your time today. Now, we know NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine, but how easy will it be to stick to this commitment over the long term, though, given that certain member states aren't so keen on supporting Ukraine as others might be?
Yeah, I think it's a question that's got to be on everyone's minds, both here in Washington and, of course, in Kyiv. There are two big challenges that the alliance faces right now in supporting Ukraine. The first is what you alluded to, which is the political unity within the alliance, which was very strong at the start of the war in the face of this brutal Russian aggression, has become less strong over the course of the last 2.5 years. And I think as some experts and officials and political leaders look towards 2025, they're beginning to wonder, what can we do to try to bring this disastrous war to an end? I mean, you were showing footage earlier of the horrible strike that took place on that hospital in Ukraine. And we don't want to be seeing these things a year from now. So I think that there is a growing sentiment that something needs to be done to bring this war to an end. And of course, there are going to be some countries that want to do more to support Ukraine than others. And I expect to see those divisions grow over the course of the next year. Of course, there are also real issues about what kind of assistance is available, what kind of military assistance is actually available. NATO militaries and industry are very strained to provide the kinds of weapons that Ukraine needs, and whether or not they can do it indefinitely is something that is really a real question that we need to take seriously.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there's supporting Ukraine and then there's offering Ukraine membership. Now, you've said yourself that admitting Ukraine to NATO would be a mistake for both Ukraine and the alliance. Tell us why you said that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think certainly under current conditions it would be a mistake, and at any time in the near future it would be a mistake. There are three basic reasons why it doesn't seem to make sense to me. I mean, the first is that if we're going to be realistic about this, bringing Ukraine into NATO imports a gigantic vulnerability into the alliance. Ukraine has got 300,000 men under arms fighting Russia right now. Those men are going to need to be reintegrated into the Ukrainian economy once the war is over, if the Ukrainian economy is going to have any hope of taking off. And so who's going to fill that gap? That gap is going to have to come from European countries or from the United States, none of whom have, or very few of whom at least, have demonstrated much of an interest in putting large numbers of forces into Ukraine now, and why they would do that in the future. I doubt that they would. And so as a result, we risk being in a situation where we've made an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine. In other words, a commitment to come to its defense as an alliance, but we're not really ready to fulfill that. And that seems like a huge liability to me.
So how can NATO effectively support Ukraine now without escalating the war further?
Well, I think obviously a lot of the steps that have been taken to try to provide Ukraine with some kind of meaningful defense against further Russian advances are important, and it's important that they continue. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about what we tell Ukraine is going to happen over the medium and the long term. And I fear sometimes that we have promised more to Ukraine, both implicitly and explicitly, than the alliance is going to be ready to deliver. As far as I can tell, there is still, in theory, a support within the alliance for Ukraine retaking all of its territory, but this just isn't a realistic war aim. And so we need to get real about that and start taking the possibility of some kind of a ceasefire, probably that involves negotiations that no one wants to undertake with the brutal regime in Moscow. But that seems like the only way to get this war to an end and to get terrible things like the bombing that we saw yesterday to stop.
Can I ask you how domestic political battles in the US might influence NATO's support for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that if Donald Trump should be elected president this fall, that he's going to take a different approach to Ukraine than the approach that the Biden administration has taken. The question is, how different is that approach going to be? And I think there have been a number of different ideas that are put out there, but I would say that it probably, under a Trump administration, the approach to Ukraine would range between withdrawing, precipitous withdrawal of U.S. support, which would be very difficult for European allies to fill in, and some kind of an effort to bring about a negotiated settlement, potentially even with even by increasing pressure on Russia, for example, by allowing Ukraine to strike more deeply into Russian territories. We don't know exactly what a Trump policy on Ukraine would look like, but it's certain to be different from the unconditional support that the Biden administration has provided Ukraine, and that's sure to create massive divisions and difficulties within NATO.
Chris Chivvis, Director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you so much for your time, Chris. We appreciate it.
At 75, most of us hope to be enjoying the perks of retirement and taking things a little bit slower. Well, for NATO, that couldn't be further from the truth. It's been 75 years since the US, Canada, and Western European countries forged an alliance to deter Soviet expansionism, keep peace in Europe, and encourage European political integration. What began with just 12 members has now grown into an alliance of 32 nations. Today, their leaders and partners are meeting in Washington for a summit that will be much more than just a birthday celebration. The challenges facing them are many, some old, some new. Supplying Ukraine with what it needs to fight off Russia's invasion will be top of the agenda. So once again, NATO faces the question of how to contain Russia. But the big picture is more complicated now. Among other issues, leaders are seeking ways to push back against Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in the Indo-Pacific region. DW's Ines Pohl reports.
NATO was created on a promise. The US and Western Europe would defend each other as they would defend themselves. Their common enemy then, the Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, the West seemed to have won, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine more than 2 years ago changed everything. NATO suddenly became relevant again, and its future is now in the political spotlight. When leaders from member countries gather in Washington, it's not just for a birthday party and a celebration of its recent expansion to 32 member states. They'll also discuss changes already taken and those still necessary in response of Russia's invasion to Ukraine. They'll be anxiously looking at America's future engagement, and they'll be also looking beyond Europe. NATO's increased presence in the Indo-Pacific region is designed to defend democracy and protect a region crucial to the global economy. But some say this increased presence will not be welcome.
I think NATO and its member states and other European institutions do suffer from charges of double standards or hypocrisy when it comes to universalizing their mission. And the feeling in many parts of the global south is that those standards only apply when European security or NATO interests are at stake, but are conveniently set aside when other countries share similar concerns about things happening in their regions and their countries.
Considering the many conflict zones in which NATO is engaged, it's likely to need more money. That makes the question of how American support will look in the future even more important. Some are asking, even if the United States government keeps paying money, will they continue paying attention?
Regardless of who the next president of the United States is, and regardless of what political agenda he or she has, the Americans might focus more on the Indo-Pacific for reasons involving China and other factors. And if they do that, it's not certain that they will be able to maintain their engagement in Europe to the same extent as in the past decades. And if that's the case, if that happens, then we must prepare ourselves for it. That is the challenge we must collectively face in Europe.
And the prospect of a second Donald Trump presidency puts a shadow over all of this.
Well, I think Trump will cause NATO severe difficulties even if he doesn't withdraw, although I think it's more likely he will withdraw.
Outwardly, the summit will celebrate NATO's 75-year success story, but delegates will be wrestling with many existential questions.
And I'm joined now by Rose Gottemüller. She was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO for 3 years under Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Today, she's a lecturer at Stanford's University Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Welcome to the day, Rose. Now, this summit marks NATO's 75th anniversary. Where do you see NATO at 75?
At 75, I see NATO as a surprisingly strong and coherent organization. It is the, I would say, longest surviving alliance in history, and it has, in recent years, continued to build and develop its strength and coherence in really countering this aggression, helping Ukraine to fight Russia and to push back against Russian aggression in Europe. And so I do think that the alliance is at its 75th birthday in a relatively good spot, at least in terms of its internal coherence and its strength of purpose.
Looking at the state of the world more broadly, and with one of your areas of expertise being arms control, do you think we're now in a more dangerous nuclear situation than we were during the Cold War?
Frankly, it's true that Vladimir Putin has been rattling the nuclear saber, as well as his loyal deputies, throughout this war in Ukraine. I think, frankly, that the greatest, in some ways, threat has passed. There was a time in October, November of 2022 when the Russians thought they were losing and they seemed to be ready to pull the nuclear trigger. But now they seem to be in, they think they're in a better situation. So although they continue to threaten nuclear use, I think in the end of the day that they feel more confident in their conventional capabilities now, and they're playing a waiting game also. They think that time is on their side in this war.
You were the first, and to this day only, woman to serve as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. There has never been a female Secretary General. I want to know from you, because you know the alliance from the inside, you know the structures. Is NATO still a boys' club to this day?
Well, I hope I won't long be the first and only Deputy Secretary General of NATO who's a female, but we'll see what happens. There will be a new Deputy Secretary General selected at the same time that Mark Rutte is assuming his post as the new Secretary General. So I think it's a good moment to think about who the next one might be as a female. But you know, it's interesting. I have seen a big change in NATO even in the time I was there. I think when I arrived in 2016 in October, yes, NATO was still significantly a boys' club. But in that time, and I give Jens Stoltenberg and his Assistant Secretaries General full credit for this, they have really pushed hard to bring women into not only the top leadership of the organization, but where it's important to change the culture, and that is into middle and lower management levels as well. So I really do think that NATO is in a better place than it was in 2016 when I arrived.
What are the effects of giving more women a seat at the table at a place like NATO, a defense alliance?
I think that having women at the table in any event brings a different problem-solving dynamic. Women don't tend to get into the same zero-sum standoffs that men can sometimes get into when they're butting heads. Women are willing to look around for ways to bring the temperature down and to try to find a solution that makes sense for everybody. They're also very good at bringing a lot of stakeholders to the table and making sure that everybody is satisfied, so that in the end of the day you don't have kind of attempts to undo a decision in the back offices and in the corridors. So I think in many ways having more women managers at NATO at every level has helped the alliance to be a better organization.
Now that you mentioned stakeholders, many of them are in Washington this week. What's at stake for the alliance and its partners at the summit?
I think really the resolve of NATO is the big question on the table, the resolve to continue its assistance to Ukraine front and center, but also the resolve to continue to move into the future, because there's a lot going on in innovation and technology. There's a lot of developments we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine in terms of the use of drones and so forth. So many, many changes occurring in how war will be fought in the future, and NATO needs to stay ahead of that curve. So technology and innovation, how will NATO adapt? How will NATO continue to move into the future as an effective military and fighting force? This is going to be a very important aspect of what NATO is working on as well at this summit. And it's a big challenge because it's expensive. It requires those investments that some NATO member states have been reluctant to make in the past. They're doing better now, much better. But nevertheless, it will be a big resource investment in future.
Yeah. President Joe Biden hosts this summit, and he does so under intense scrutiny. How big a role do you expect the discussion about his fitness for office to play at the meeting?
Well, you know, Joe Biden is our most experienced politician, in my view, and over the years he has taken an enormous amount of interest in foreign and defense policy. So he is also very experienced in terms of the NATO agenda and in terms of what is a priority for NATO. So I do believe that he is certainly, in terms of his experience and knowledge, he is very fit and ready to continue that leadership role. Of course, his age has been a huge question in our election campaign. It really burst even more onto the scene after the debacle of the debate with Mr. Trump a couple of weeks ago. But I do hope that members will find that the president is focused on the issues that matter to them and also the issues that matter to future strength and coherence of NATO.
Do you think NATO allies and partners are right to be concerned about Biden after all these episodes that you just named?
I think it'll be up to President Biden during this summit meeting to convey that he is, as he's said time and time again, ready to carry his presidency forward into a second term. And so he's going to have to make that case to the allies. There's no question, because there are many, many questions on the table. So he's going to have to answer to those concerns. And I think he will be able to do so, but a lot depends on what else is happening in the world these days. And these days there are pressures arising from all directions, referring to the terrible attack that the Russians perpetrated on a children's hospital in Kiev. I'm expecting and worried about more such mischief as the summit unfolds.
Yeah. Now, whether or not he'll be able to reassure partners, there are serious doubts about whether he'll be able to beat Donald Trump. What would a second Trump term mean for the alliance?
Well, you know, I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO during Trump's first term in office, and I saw him during several summit meetings at NATO. He was unrelenting, clearly, in pushing the alliance to spend more, the allies in Europe and Canada to spend more on their own defense. And they had committed at Wales, the summit in Wales in 2014, after Putin invaded Crimea, they committed to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And so Trump was unrelenting. Pressure was very high. But to be honest with you, Secretary General Stoltenberg, my boss, and I felt that it was important that the president was pressing this point. American presidents from Jack Kennedy on have said that the allies are freeloading. They need to be spending more on their own defense. The United States cannot carry the burden alone. And so that message in some ways was very welcome. So I say Trump got the momentum going during his first time in office. I think he'll be pleased now that more allies have stepped up. 23 out of 32 allies are now spending 2% of GDP on defense. That's because of Putin and the threat he poses.
Yeah, but he's also made remarks along the lines that countries that don't reach that 2% kind of a goal would be, in a way, and I'm paraphrasing here, a fair game for Russia. Where does that leave NATO as a whole? Because that defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Well, Trump says a lot on the campaign trail that I don't know if he would bring into office with him. If you can say anything about Donald Trump, he is unpredictable. But I think it's going to be up to the allies, those remaining 9 allies who have not reached 2% of GDP, to really get themselves into gear and work to approach that level, because the allies are also agreeing at this summit, interestingly, that 2% is not a ceiling, it's a floor. And that all allies need to be prepared to spend more on their own defense and go beyond 2% of GDP. So there's not going to be any space for the laggards, essentially. And I think that will have to be a very strong message coming out of this summit. As for Trump's threats that we would have a kind of two-speed alliance with some countries, under the protection of the Article 5 treaty commitment to defend them should they be attacked, and others not because they haven't spent enough. This is a recipe for tearing the alliance apart. So I think it's an idiotic idea, and frankly, it's going to be something that the allies are going to have to, I think, work hard to address should Trump come back into office again.
Now, we are celebrating, or NATO is celebrating, the 75th anniversary this year. 75 years from now, do you think NATO will still exist?
Well, 75 years from now, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if all the principles in the UN Charter were equally embraced and agreed by every country around the world, and there was no more aggression and no more threats to sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I would hope for that nirvana to appear, but I kind of doubt it. So yes, I think there'll be a role for NATO 75 years from now, and I think it could come into that at that point 150th birthday as strong and coherent as ever.
That was Rose Gottemüller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for making the time.
My pleasure.